Welcome to Uncloseted Conversations. Even if you stumbled upon this channel by accident, you are welcome here. The stories here are from my heart, from my soul, from my pen to your ears. I hope that you will stay a little longer and open yourself to the magic of storytelling. Here I write fiction, and though not always aligning with reality, it still tugs at heartstrings. Stories are escapes and sometimes a balm to the soul. So, enjoy your time here, and if reality presses down too loud and too hard, come knock at the door, come in, take a seat, grab a coffee, and just exhale. These are veil-bound stories, and the space is free and non-judgmental. Sit back, earphones or pods in, and let's listen to another exquisite romance. Taming the Beast. She owned the city, but the angel owned her heart. Chapter 1. The Audacity of Rowan Valenti. The Spitfire Angel's clubhouse didn't smell like expensive perfume and imported marble. It smelled of grease, burnt rubber, and the kind of autonomy money couldn't buy. Rowan Valenti adjusted her silk blazer, the heels of her designer boots clicking a sharp, rhythmic tempo against the concrete floor as she bypassed two leather-clad sentries who were too stunned by her sheer nerve to stop her. She pushed open the heavy oak door to the back office without knocking. Storm Varga was hunched over a desk cluttered with ledger books and a disassembled carburetor. She didn't look up. The overhead light caught the ink on Storm's forearms, dark, intricate patterns that looked like armor. Rowan leaned against the doorframe, crossing her arms. She'd heard the rumors. Storm Varga was the woman who broke hands for a misplaced look and hadn't felt a heartbeat in her chest for anyone in a decade. I was going to ask if you wanted to do me on that desk, but I thought I'd at least say hello first. Rowan's voice wasn't arrogant. It was worse. It was steady. It was the voice of a woman who is used to her presence being a gift. Storm finally looked up. Her eyes were the color of a brewing hurricane, devoid of the spark Rowan was used to seeing in her conquests. No lust, no intimidation. Just boredom. Are you clinically insane? Or just annoying? Storm's voice was flat, a low rasp that sent an involuntary shiver down Rowan's spine. Probably both, Rowan retorted, a sharp, playful smirk tugging at the corner of her mouth. She took a step into the room, her gaze raking over Storm with the hunger of a predator who had finally found something worth chasing. I take it you don't know who I am. Well, that's about to change. I'm Rowan Valenti. I imagine you've heard the name. I usually get a bit more enthusiasm. Storm stood slowly. She didn't just rise, she reclaimed the space. She was taller than Rowan expected, her shoulders broad under a faded black tank top, her presence heavy enough to make the oxygen in the room feel thin. She walked around the desk, her movement fluid and predatory. She stopped inches from Rowan. The scent of motor oil and peppermint hit Rowan like a physical blow. Storm didn't look at Rowan's lips. She looked at her throat, like she was deciding where to plant a blade. You're a long way from your penthouse, Valenti, Storm said, her voice dropping an octave. Around here, your name doesn't get you a seat at the table. It just makes you a louder target. Now, give me one reason why I shouldn't throw you out of that window for interrupting my work with that pathetic line. Rowan didn't flinch. She leaned in closer, the heat radiating off Storm's body making her pulse thrum. Because, Rowan whispered, I think we both know you're the first person in this city who isn't afraid to actually do it. And that, Storm, is incredibly hot. You walked in here thinking your name carries weight in my clubhouse, Valenti. But here, you're just another suit with a god complex and a mouth that's working overtime. Rowan didn't flinch. And you're just as terrifying as the rumors say, Rowan murmured, a slow, dangerous smirk spreading across her lips. I think I'm in love. Or maybe I just want to see if you bite as hard as you bark. Chapter 2. The Fire. Storm didn't even blink. The heat Rowan was radiating might have melted a lesser woman, but Storm Varga was made of reinforced steel and bad intentions. Hot. Storm repeated the word like it was a foreign language she had no interest in learning. You've spent too much time in climate-controlled rooms, Valenti. You've forgotten what real fire feels like. Before Rowan could drop another silky retort, Storm's hand shot out. It wasn't a slap or a shove, it was a calculated, vice-like grip on Rowan's upper arm. The leather of Storm's fingerless gloves was cool, but the strength behind the squeeze was absolute. "Hey," Rowan started, her breath hitching as she was spun around with effortless, jarring force. "You wanted to see the clubhouse?" Storm's voice was right against Rowan's ear, low and dangerously calm. "Let's give you the tour. Starting with the exit." Storm didn't just lead her, she marched her. Rowan's designer boots scrambled for purchase on the concrete as she was steered out of the office and back into the main bay. The music, heavy, distorted rock, seemed to dip as the Spitfire Angels caught sight of their leader hauling the city's most polished mafia boss toward the double steel doors. "Storm, wait," Rowan laughed, though it sounded a bit breathless. The sheer audacity of being handled this way was doing things to her heart rate that she wasn't ready to admit. "You're ruining a $3,000 blazer. Consider it a consulting fee for the lesson I'm giving you," Storm shot back, not slowing her pace. They reached the heavy front doors. With her free hand, Storm threw them open, letting the humid night air and the roar of distant traffic flood in. She didn't stop until they were on the gravel lot, right next to Rowan's pristine, blacked-out Italian sports car that looked like a sleek alien craft parked among a fleet of scarred Harleys. Storm let go so abruptly that Rowan stumbled a half-step. "Listen closely, Valenti," Storm said, stepping into Rowan's personal space, her shadow looming long under the flickering neon sign of the clubhouse. "I don't care who you've bought, who you've bored, or who you've betted. My girls and I, we aren't your challenge. We aren't a boredom cure." Storm reached out, her thumb hooking under Rowan's chin, forcing her to look up. For a second, the arrogance in Rowan's eyes flickered into something sharper, genuine hunger. "If you come back here without an invitation," Storm whispered, her eyes dark as oil, "I won't use the door. I'll use the asphalt. Get in your car and go back to your ivory tower before I decide your suit looks better covered in road rash." Storm stepped back, her expression returning to that terrifying, flat vacuum of emotion. She didn't wait for a reply. She turned her back, a deliberate, stinging insult to a woman like Rowan, and walked back toward the clubhouse, the heavy doors thudding shut behind her with a finality that echoed in the quiet lot. Rowan stood by her car, her arms still tingling where Storm had held her. She touched her chin, a slow, predatory grin spreading across her face. "Oh," Rowan murmured to the empty air, "we are definitely doing this." Chapter 3. The Insult in a Box. Rowan Valenti's office was a shrine to glass, steel, and silent power, perched so high above the city that the people below looked like ants she could crush with a manicured thumb. She wasn't looking at the view, though. She was sitting behind her desk, rotating a heavy crystal glass of whiskey, her mind replaying the way Storm's hand had felt on her arm. Most people touched Rowan like she was made of porcelain or dynamite. Storm had handled her like she was a nuisance that needed to be relocated. It was intoxicating. "She thinks I'm a bored socialite," Rowan murmured, a dangerous glint in her dark eyes. "She thinks I'm looking for a pet." Rowan tapped a button on her intercom. "Marco, I need a delivery made to the Spitfire Angel's clubhouse. Not the usual flowers. I want something loud." 2 hours later, a flatbed truck rolled into the gravel lot of the clubhouse. Storm was under a 1974 shovelhead, her face streaked with oil and her knuckles barked raw from a stubborn bolt. The roar of the truck's hydraulic lift made her slide out from under the bike, a wrench still gripped in her hand like a weapon. "What the hell is this?" Storm demanded, wiping her hands on a rag that was more grease than fabric. A driver in a crisp uniform hopped out, looking terrified as 20 women in leather vests circled the truck like wolves. "Delivery for A. Captain Varga?" From a Ms. Valenti. He dropped the gate. On the back of the truck sat a brand-new, cherry red, limited edition Ducati Panigale. It was a masterpiece of Italian engineering, sleek, aerodynamic, and worth more than the clubhouse's yearly mortgage. It looked like a drop of blood in a field of charcoal. Tied to the handlebars was a single, oversized bouquet of white lilies, the kind used for funerals, and a small, cream-colored card. Storm walked up to it, her eyes narrowing until they were mere slits. The rest of the angels were whispering, some impressed, some offended on Storm's behalf. Storm snatched the card. It read, "Since you're so fond of speed and things that bite, I thought you could use an upgrade. The Harleys are charming, but this is a machine that can actually keep up with me. Don't be a stranger, Storm. RV." The silence in the lot was deafening. Storm looked at the bike, the upgrade, and then at the lilies. To a biker, calling their ride charming and offering an upgrade wasn't a romantic gesture, it was a declaration of war. It was Rowan saying Storm's lifestyle was a hobby and Rowan's money was the solution. She sent funeral flowers. Jax, Storm's second-in-command, muttered, leaning over. "Is that a threat or a date?" "It's an insult," Storm hissed. She felt a heat rising in her chest that had nothing to do with the summer sun. Rowan Valenti was trying to buy her. Worse, she was trying to refine her. Storm looked at the Ducati. It was beautiful. It was perfect. And she hated every inch of its polished carbon fiber. "Jax," Storm said, her voice dropping into that terrifyingly quiet register. "Yeah, boss. Get the spray paint. The neon pink kind we use for marking the track. And find me a heavy-duty chain." "What are we doing?" Storm's smile was jagged. "We're sending a thank you note." Chapter 4, Disgraced Gift. The message was loud, clear, and smelled like aerosol fumes. Inside the glass-walled lobby of Valenti Enterprises, the midday rush of lawyers and analysts came to a grinding halt. The sound started as a low rumble in the distance, the synchronized thunder of 20 V-twin engines, and ended with the screech of tires and the smell of burning rubber right on the sidewalk. Rowan was in the middle of a high-stakes board meeting, 30 floors up, when her assistant burst in, face pale. "Ms. Valenti, there's a situation. Downstairs." Rowan didn't even ask. She stood, a slow, knowing smile spreading across her face, and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows. Below, the sidewalk was a sea of black leather and chrome. And right in the center, parked illegally across the marble entrance, was the Ducati. It was unrecognizable. The pristine, cherry-red Italian paint had been savagely buried under layers of jagged, neon-pink spray paint. Streaked across the side fairing in black dripping letters were the words, "Not for sale." But it was the heavy-duty industrial chain that sent the real message. It was wound tightly around the handlebars and the frame, looped over the seat, and finished with a massive, rusted padlock that hung off the front fork like a grim, metallic noose. Rowan took the private elevator down. The lobby doors hissed open, and she stepped out into the humid air. The biker crew was already pulling away, a wall of noise and middle fingers, but one figure remained. Storm was idling her battered, blacked-out Harley a few feet away. She wasn't wearing a helmet. Her dark hair was windblown, and she had a smudge of neon-pink paint on her cheekbone that looked like a war stripe. Rowan walked up to the ruined, chained masterpiece. She ran a finger over the rough pink paint. "You have terrible taste in colors, Storm. And you have a habit of overestimating your bank account," Storm countered. She didn't turn off her engine. The bike thrummed between her thighs like a caged animal. "That chain is 500 pounds of hardened steel. It'll take your best boys all afternoon to cut through it. Every minute they're out here, the whole city gets to see exactly what I think of your upgrade." Rowan looked from the bike to Storm. The arrogance she usually wore like a shield was cracking, replaced by a genuine, sharp-edged fascination. "You're making this very difficult for me to ignore you." "That's the point," Valenti, Storm said, her eyes flashing with a dangerous, cold fire. "I don't want to be ignored. I want to be left alone. There's a difference." Storm kicked her bike into gear, the rear tire kicking up a spray of gravel that pelted the side of Rowan's expensive building. Next time you want to spend money, buy yourself some common sense. It's the one thing you're clearly lacking. She didn't wait for a rebuttal. Storm roared off, weaving through traffic with a reckless grace that left Rowan breathless. Rowan stood on the sidewalk, the neon-pink noose glinting in the sun. Her security team rushed out, tools in hand, looking panicked. "Miss Valenti, we'll get this cleared away immediately, we're so sorry." "Don't," Rowan said, her voice sharp. She was still staring at the spot where Storm had vanished. "Leave it for an hour. I want everyone who enters this building to see it." She touched her throat, where the phantom heat of Storm's gaze still lingered. "She's not just a flame," Rowan whispered to herself, a dark, hungry thrill racing through her veins. "She's the whole damn forest fire." Chapter 5: The Debt of Blood. Rowan Valenti didn't become the head of the Valenti family by being a bored socialite with a penchant for expensive toys. She became the head because she was the coldest calculator in a room full of killers. While Storm was busy scrubbing neon paint off her hands at the clubhouse, Rowan was back in her sanctum, the playful mask dropped. The neon-pink Ducati was still chained to the sidewalk, a deliberate monument to her own obsession, but inside her office, the air was thick with the scent of ozone and blood. A man was kneeling on her Persian rug. He was a middle manager for the Iron Skulls, a rival biker crew that lacked the Spitfire Angel's code of ethics. They dealt in things Storm Varga would burn a building down to stop: human trafficking and synthetic opioids. "I'll ask you one more time," Rowan said, her voice dropping into a register that made the glass walls of her office seem to vibrate. She wasn't leaning, she was standing over him, a silver letter opener balanced between her fingers like a scalpel. "Who gave you permission to move product through the North Docks?" "That's Varga territory." We didn't think you cared about the Angels, boss," the man stammered, blood dripping from a split lip onto the white silk of his shirt. "They're just girls on bikes. We figured you'd want them out of the way so we could." Rowan's movement was a blur. The silver blade didn't cut him, but she pressed the cold flat of it against his eyelid. "The Spitfire Angels are none of your concern," Rowan whispered, her eyes devoid of the flirtatious spark Storm had seen. This was the Mafia boss, the woman who owned the docks, the cops, and the nightmares of her enemies. "But Storm Varga? She's mine. And you just touched something that belongs to me." "We didn't touch her," he shrieked. "We took one of her strays. The girl. The one she protects at the diner. We're holding her at the warehouse. Just as leverage to get the Angels to back off the route." Rowan froze. She knew exactly which girl he meant. She'd done her homework on Storm. Storm's weakness was her loyalty to the broken women of the city. Rowan pulled back, her expression shifting into something terrifyingly calm. She wiped the letter opener on the man's shoulder. "Marco," she called out. Her enforcer stepped from the shadows. "Clean this mess up. And get my car. Not the Ferrari. The armored SUV." "Where are we going, ma'am?" Rowan's smile was a jagged line of white teeth. "To save a life. And to prove to a certain biker that I'm much more than annoying." The Iron Skull's warehouse. Storm was already there. She was alone, her Harley laid down in the shadows of an alleyway. She was checking the magazine of a customized .45, her face a mask of cold, murderous intent. They had taken Elena, a 19-year-old runaway Storm had promised to keep safe. She was about to kick the side door in when a pair of headlights cut through the gloom of the industrial district. The blacked-out SUV pulled up, silent as a ghost. The door opened and Rowan Valenti stepped out. She wasn't wearing a silk blazer anymore. She was in tactical black, a sleek holster strapped to her thigh, her hair pulled back in a tight, severe knot. "You're late for the party," Storm hissed, her gun leveled at Rowan's chest before she realized who it was. She lowered it, her brow furrowing in confusion and fury. "What the hell are you doing here, Valenti?" This isn't your fight. The Iron Skulls used my docks to transport the girl, Rowan said, stepping into Storm's space, ignoring the weapon. The arrogance was back, but it was sharpened into a blade. That makes it my business. Besides, Rowan reached out, her fingers brushing the grip of Storm's gun, forcing the muzzle down. You're good, Storm. But there are 30 men in that warehouse with automatic weapons. You go in there alone, and you're a martyr. You go in with me. Rowan pulled a suppressed submachine gun from the back of the SUV, checking the chamber with a practiced, metallic click. And we're a massacre. Storm looked at the weapon, then at the cold, lethal hunger in Rowan's eyes. For the first time, she didn't see a rich girl playing a game. She saw a predator. If you get in my way, Storm warned, her voice a low growl, I'll shoot you myself. Promise? Rowan countered with a wink, the tension between them snapping like a live wire. Chapter 6: The Warehouse Massacre. Storm didn't give Rowan the satisfaction of a nod. She just turned toward the warehouse, her boots crunching on the gravel with purposeful lethality. You take the rafters. I'm going through the front. If you miss a shot and one of my girls gets grazed, I'm coming for your head next. Rowan's eyes gleamed. I don't miss, Storm. It's bad for branding. The Iron Skulls never stood a chance. They were expecting a biker brawl. They weren't expecting the calculated, surgical strike of a Mafia hit combined with the raw, vengeful fury of the Spitfire Angel's leader. Storm kicked the corrugated metal door off its hinges with a sound like a thunderclap. She was a whirlwind of leather and lead, moving through the maze of shipping crates with a terrifying, silent efficiency. Every time a skull leveled a rifle at her, a muffled thwip-thwip sounded from the shadows above, and the man dropped before he could pull the trigger. Rowan was a ghost in the steel girders, her suppressed MP5 spitting precision death. She watched Storm work from above, the way she used her environment, the way she shielded Elena with her own body the moment she found her tied to a chair in the center of the floor. It was over in 4 minutes. The warehouse was silent, save for the hiss of a ruptured steam pipe and the sobbing of the girl. Storm sliced through Elena's zip ties with a flick of a combat knife. I've got you, she whispered, her voice finally losing that jagged edge. You're okay. Jax is outside. Go. As the girls scrambled toward the exit, Rowan dropped from a crate, landing softly on her feet. She began to flick the safety on her weapon, her gaze sweeping the carnage with a bored indifference that chilled the air. See? Rowan said, stepping over a body to reach Storm. Much faster with 2. We make a devastating team. Storm stood up, wiping a spray of someone else's blood off her forehead. She looked at Rowan, really looked at her, taking in the tactical gear and the steady hands. The annoying socialite was gone, replaced by a woman who had clearly killed more people than she'd kissed. Rowan reached out, her fingers ghosting towards Storm's face to wipe away a stray smudge of soot. You're welcome, by the way. Storm caught Rowan's wrist midair. The grip was tight enough to bruise. Don't, Storm hissed, her voice a low vibration of warning. Don't what? Save your life? Help your girl. Rowan stepped closer, her chest nearly brushing Storm's. The adrenaline from the fight was still humming between them, thick and heavy. I think I just earned a thank you, Storm. Maybe even a drink. You earned nothing, Storm countered, her eyes like flint. You did this because your docs were used. You did this for your ego. Don't mistake a shared enemy for a friendship, Valenti. And definitely don't think this makes us even. Storm shoved Rowan's hand back toward her. You want a reward? Here it is. I won't set your car on fire for being in my territory tonight. Now get out of here before the cops, the ones you haven't bought yet, show up. Storm turned her back and walked toward the exit, her silhouette framed by the flickering industrial lights. Rowan stood in the middle of the blood-stained warehouse, a slow, genuine laugh bubbling up in her throat. Her wrist was throbbing where Storm had grabbed her, and her heart was racing in a way that had nothing to do with the gunfight. "She's impossible," Rowan whispered, a look of pure, unadulterated hunger crossing her face. "I love it." Chapter 7. The Sting of Rejection. Rowan realizes that heroism didn't work. Storm isn't impressed by power, she's suspicious of it. The high of the warehouse hit had curdled into a frustrated, pulsing ache. Back in her penthouse, the silence was too loud, and the phantom sensation of Storm's hand bruising her wrist was a brand Rowan couldn't shake. She stripped off the tactical gear, her skin still humming with the kind of adrenaline that demanded a release. Storm's rejection hadn't just stung, it had ignited a fuse. Rowan picked up her phone, her thumb hovering over a contact labeled simply, Sloane. "My place." 10 minutes, Rowan said when the line picked up. No greeting, no pleasantries. "And Sloane?" "Don't wear anything complicated." When Sloane arrived, she was exactly what Rowan usually wanted, soft, compliant, and beautifully vapid. She was a professional who knew when to moan and when to stay silent. But as Rowan pressed her against the floor-to-ceiling glass, overlooking the city lights that mirrored the coldness in her own chest, something was off. Usually, the power play of having a woman tremble under her touch was enough. Tonight, it felt like eating ash. "Rowan?" Sloane whispered, sensing the uncharacteristic tension in the way Rowan's hands gripped her hips. You're being a little rougher than usual." "Not that I mind." Rowan paused, her forehead resting against the cool glass. She closed her eyes, but she didn't see Sloane's blonde hair or blue eyes. She saw a smudge of neon pink paint on a sharp cheekbone. She heard a raspy, flat voice telling her she was nothing. Rowan pulled away abruptly, leaving Sloane shivering and confused. "Get dressed," Rowan said, her voice devoid of any post-coital warmth. She walked over to the sideboard and poured herself a double scotch, her hand trembling just a fraction. "Did I do something wrong?" Sloane asked, clutching her silk robe to her chest. "You did everything right," Rowan snapped, turning around. Her eyes were dark, swirling with a frustration that bordered on agony. "That's the problem. You're exactly what you're supposed to be. You're easy. You're predictable. And I'm bored out of my mind." She pulled a roll of high-denomination bills from her safe and tossed them onto the bed. "Take a car home. I'll call you when I'm in a better mood." Once the door clicked shut, Rowan downed the scotch in one go. The burn in her throat was nothing compared to the irritation beneath her skin. She realized then, with a sinking, exhilarating dread, that the usual wasn't going to cut it anymore. She didn't want a girl who was paid to be there. She didn't want someone who crumbled. She wanted the woman who looked at a Mafia Queen and saw a nuisance. She wanted the fire that threatened to burn her fingers off. Rowan walked over to her desk and picked up a burner phone, dialing a number she rarely used. "Marco. Find out where the Angels drink when they aren't at the clubhouse. No suits, no backup. Just get me the name of the bar." If Storm Varga wouldn't let her in the front door, Rowan would find a way through the back. Chapter 8. The Placeholder. The Rusty Bolt was the kind of place where the air was 40% tobacco smoke, 50% cheap hops, and 10% the threat of a localized riot. It was a windowless box of a bar where the lighting was kept low so you couldn't see exactly what you were stepping in. When Rowan Valenti walked in, the jukebox skipped a beat. She wasn't in a suit. She wore a pair of dark, well-worn jeans and a black silk tank top that cost more than the motorcycles parked outside, topped with a leather jacket that looked suspiciously like she'd broken it in herself. She looked like a predator trying to blend in with the scavengers and failing because she was too damn sleek. She walked straight to the bar, ignoring the low whistles and the sudden, heavy silence from the booth in the corner where the Spitfire Angel sat. "A round for the house," Rowan said, sliding a black credit card across the scarred wood. "Actually, make it 2 rounds. Top shelf for anyone who knows what that is, and the swill for everyone else." The bartender hesitated, then shrugged and started pouring. The tension in the room didn't vanish, but it shifted. You don't turn down free booze, even if it comes from the devil. Jax, Storm's second-in-command, sat at the pool table, chalking her cue with slow, deliberate strokes. She watched Rowan with the narrowed eyes of a hawk. She pulled out her phone and sent a quick text. Jax, the Mafia Queen is at the Bolt. Buying the house. She's looking for you. Hard. Rowan took a seat at the bar, her back to the room, a move of pure, unadulterated arrogance. She sipped a bottom-shelf tequila like it was fine vintage, waiting. 5 minutes passed. 10. 20. Jax's phone buzzed. Storm, let her wait. I'm busy. Rowan saw the message, not because she hacked it, but because Jax walked over and slammed her own phone down next to Rowan's drink so she could read the screen. She isn't coming, Jax said, her voice like sandpaper. Storm doesn't do performances. And she definitely doesn't do you. Rowan looked at the text, the blue light reflecting in her dark eyes. The rejection should have been insulting. It should have made her walk out in a huff. Instead, it made her pulse skip. Storm was the only person in the tri-state area who had the balls to leave Rowan Valenti sitting at a sticky bar in the middle of a literal gutter. Busy, is she? Rowan murmured, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across her face. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a gold lighter, and flicked it open. The flame danced in the dim light. I like a woman who prioritizes her work. It makes the eventual distractions so much more explosive. Rowan turned her head to look at Jax. Tell her I'm staying for another hour. Tell her if she doesn't show, I might just have to start buying up the debt on this charming little hole in the wall. I'd hate to be her landlord. Jax didn't flinch. You can buy the building, Valenti. You can't buy the woman. You're wasting your time. Is that what you think? Rowan stood up, leaning in close to Jax, her voice dropping to a whisper that only the biker could hear. I'm not trying to buy her, Jax. I'm trying to see how long it takes for her to realize I'm the only one in this city who can actually handle her when she's angry. Rowan stayed. She stayed for 2 hours. She played 3 games of pool, losing the first 2 on purpose and sharking the third so badly the local regular walked away cursing. Storm never showed. When Rowan finally walked out into the cool night air, she wasn't frustrated. She was vibrating. The emotional pull was starting to tug at her, a genuine, irritating need to be in Storm's orbit. Chapter 9. The Midnight Visit. Rowan knows where the clubhouse is, but she also knows where Storm lives. A small, converted warehouse by the river. The rain wasn't just a drizzle. It was a heavy, rhythmic assault that turned the riverfront into a blurred landscape of gray and black. Storm's home, a squat, industrial warehouse that looked like it belonged to a different century, loomed ahead. Inside, Storm was hunched over a workbench, the smell of solder and old grease filling the air. She heard the heavy thud of a car door, then the persistent, rhythmic pounding on her metal front door. She knew that knock. It was too insistent to be a neighbor and too rhythmic to be a threat. She pulled the heavy steel door open, and the humidity hit her first. Then she saw Rowan. The Mafia Queen looked like a drowned cat, but her eyes were still burning with that relentless, stubborn fire. Her silk tank top was plastered to her skin, and water was streaming down her face, dripping off her chin onto the concrete threshold. It's raining, Valenti, Storm said, her voice flat, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of disbelief. Yes, I want to be dramatic. I'm trying to have a serious conversation with you. Rowan snapped, wiping water from her eyes with a frustrated flick of her wrist. And I'm trying to avoid it. Storm shot back. She went to swing the door shut, but Rowan moved faster, wedging her designer boot in the gap. Storm looked down at the shoe, then back up at Rowan's face. The arrogance was gone. In its place was a raw, jagged edge of desperation that made Storm's chest tighten in a way she absolutely detested. Move the foot, Rowan. Or I'll break the ankle. I don't care how much the surgery costs. Do it then, Rowan challenged, stepping closer until she was almost touching the door frame. Break it. At least then I'll know you're feeling something other than that bored, icy indifference you keep throwing at me. You didn't show up at the bar. You didn't answer the text. You're treated me like a ghost, Storm, and I am the most substantial thing in your life right now. Storm let out a sharp, cynical laugh. Substantial? You're a distraction. You're a wealthy woman with a savior complex who thinks because she helped out in a warehouse, she gets a key to the city. I told you, I don't catch feelings, and I don't play games. This isn't a game. Rowan stepped inside, forcing Storm to back up or be run over. The door slammed shut behind them, cutting off the roar of the rain, leaving them in a charged, heavy silence. Rowan stood there, shivering slightly, her clothes clinging to every curve. The sexual tension in the room was so thick it felt like it could be carved with a blade. Why are you really here? Storm asked, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous rasp. She took a step toward Rowan, closing the distance until their breath mingled. Is it the power? Do you just want to see if you can break the one person who doesn't bow? Rowan looked up at her, her voice finally losing its edge, turning into something soft and terrifyingly honest. I'm here because since I met you, nothing else tastes like anything. The girls, the business, the money, it's all gray. You're the only thing that's in color, Storm. And it's infuriating. Chapter 10, The Breaking Point. The air in the warehouse didn't just feel heavy, it felt combustible. Storm took a predatory step forward, her shadow swallowing Rowan's smaller frame. She didn't stop until Rowan's lower back hit the edge of the heavy wooden workbench. Tools rattled, a wrench clattering to the floor, but neither of them looked down. Storm's hands, calloused and smelling of iron and salt, landed on the bench on either side of Rowan, pinning her. You want color, Valenti? Storm's voice was a low, vibrating growl against Rowan's ear. You want to see if I'm real? Rowan's breath hitched, her head tilting back as Storm's hand moved. It wasn't a gentle touch. Storm's palm landed on Rowan's wet knee and dragged upward with a slow, agonizing deliberation. The friction of the damp denim against Rowan's skin sent a jolt of pure electricity through her. Rowan's eyes fluttered shut, her fingers curling into the edge of the workbench. She was shivering, but it wasn't from the cold anymore. Storm's hand climbed higher, the heat of her palm searing through the fabric, moving up the curve of Rowan's thigh with a possessive, terrifying rhythm. Storm leaned in, her lips a fraction of an inch from Rowan's throat. She could feel the frantic, heavy thrum of Rowan's pulse. You think you can handle the fire? Storm whispered. Her hand reached the very top of Rowan's inner thigh, stopping just short of the seam of her jeans, the heat radiating from the contact point making Rowan gasp, her hips instinctively arching toward the touch. The tension snapped tight, a bowstring pulled to the point of breaking. Rowan was a breath away from begging, her eyes opening to find Storm's hurricane-gray gaze fixed on her with a hunger that was almost feral. Then the heat vanished. Storm ripped her hand away as if she'd been burned. She stepped back, the void of her presence leaving Rowan cold and reeling. Without a word, Storm walked to the heavy steel door and flung it wide. The sound of the torrential rain flooded back into the room, drowning out the sound of their ragged breathing. Get out, Storm said. Her voice was back to that flat, emotionless vacuum. The mask was back on, bolted down tighter than before. Rowan stood by the workbench, her body still vibrating, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked at Storm, her lips parted, looking for a trace of the woman who had just had her pinned. There was nothing. Storm. I said leave, Rowan. Storm didn't look at her. She stared out into the dark, wet street. You got your dramatic moment. Now go back to your penthouse and find someone who wants to play your games. Because I'm done. Rowan straightened her jacket, her hands trembling with a mix of fury and unspent desire. She walked toward the door, stopping only when she was level with Storm. She leaned in, her voice a sharp, jagged promise. "You can open the door all you want, Storm. But we both know you're the one who's trapped in here." Rowan stepped out into the rain. The steel door slammed shut behind her with a finality that echoed through the empty warehouse. Chapter 11: Scorched Earth. The aftermath was a study in two different kinds of wreckage. In the warehouse, Storm sat in the silence, the ghost of Rowan's heat still clinging to her palm. But across the city, the Valenti Empire was finding out what happened when its queen was denied. The sun hadn't even fully cleared the horizon before the first blood hit the pavement. Rowan hadn't slept. She had traded her silk and lace for a sharp, charcoal gray suit that felt like armor, her eyes rimmed with a cold, caffeinated fury. She didn't want a distraction anymore. She wanted to tear the world apart until it felt as jagged as she did. By 8 a.m., 3 rival high-stakes gambling dens had been shuttered, their owners sent to the hospital with reminders of who owned the zip code. By 10 a.m., the docks were under a total lockdown. Marco, her second-in-command, stood in the corner of her office, his hand hovering near his holster. He had seen Rowan Valenti order executions without blinking, but he had never seen her like this. She wasn't cold. She was volcanic. "Boss," Marco ventured, his voice cautious. "The Iron Skull's leadership is asking for a sit-down. They're terrified. You've crippled their distribution in 4 hours. If we keep pushing this hard, we're going to start a street war we didn't budget for." Rowan spun around, a glass of espresso in her hand. She didn't look tired, she looked electrified. "Budget for it, then. I want the skulls dismantled. Not pushed back. I want them erased. Every street they claim, every girl they've intimidated, I want it under the Valenti flag by sunset." "The board is calling," Marco added, his brow furrowing. "They're worried you're losing focus. They say this feels personal." Rowan slammed the espresso glass onto her desk. The crack echoed like a gunshot. "It is personal, Marco. This city has become complacent. Everyone thinks they can just walk in, take what they want, and leave without a scratch." She was thinking of Storm's hand on her thigh. She was thinking of the way Storm had opened that door and tossed her out like trash. "Tell the board that if they have a problem with my methods, they can meet me at the docks," Rowan hissed, her voice a low, terrifying vibrate. "And tell them to bring their wills. I'm not playing the diplomat today. I'm playing the beast." The clubhouse, midday. Back at the Spitfire Angel's headquarters, the atmosphere was thick with unease. Jax walked into the garage, where Storm was aggressively scrubbing the floor, trying to wash away the memory of the night before. "Storm," Jax said, tossing a tablet onto the workbench. "You might want to see this." Storm didn't stop scrubbing. "Unless the building is on fire, I don't care." "The city is on fire," Jax countered. "Valenti has gone rogue. She's hitting everyone. Word is she's hunting the rest of the Iron Skulls, the ones we missed at the warehouse. But she's doing it with a brutality that's scaring the hell out of the local cops. She's burning every bridge she has." Storm stopped. She stood up, her back aching, her heart doing a slow, heavy roll in her chest. She looked at the tablet. The news reports were a blur of blue lights and Valenti-owned logos. Storm knew exactly what this was. This wasn't a business move. This was a tantrum. A lethal, expensive, mafia-grade tantrum because Storm had dared to show her the door. "She's going to get herself killed," Storm muttered, her jaw tightening. "Or she's going to get us killed," Jax reminded her. "The Skulls think we're the ones who set her off. They're looking for a target they can actually hit, Storm. And we're a lot easier to find than a woman in a bulletproof penthouse." Chapter 12: The Crash. The shift in the city's atmosphere went from business as usual to apocalyptic in under 24 hours. Rowan was a hurricane, but hurricanes eventually draw out the desperate. The Iron Skulls knew they were being hunted into extinction. They couldn't hit the Valenti fortress, but they knew who the Queen was obsessed with. Storm was on a solo run, the cool night air usually the only thing that could clear the ghost of Rowan's touch from her mind. She didn't see the blacked-out SUV until it was already merging into her lane at 80 miles per hour. It wasn't a hit, it was a murder attempt. The impact sent her Harley into a violent wobble before she was launched over the guardrail, the bike tumbling behind her in a spray of sparks and twisted chrome. When the paramedics wheeled Storm into the ER, she was barely conscious, her leather jacket shredded and her shoulder shattered. The Valenti penthouse, 3 a.m. Marco entered the office with the posture of a man walking toward a firing squad. Rowan was standing by the window, a glass of amber liquid in her hand, looking out at the city she was currently dismantling. "Boss," Marco whispered. "It's Varga." An Iron Skull enforcer ran her off the bridge on the east side. "She's in the ICU. They don't know if she'll keep the arm." The glass in Rowan's hand didn't just break, it powdered. Shards of crystal embedded in her palm, but she didn't even flinch. She turned around, and for the first time in his life, Marco saw a look in Rowan's eyes that made him want to pray. It wasn't rage. It was a cold, soul-deep erasure of humanity. "Find him," Rowan said. Her voice wasn't a growl. It was a dead, hollow sound. "I don't want him dead. Not yet." The Iron Skull's final stronghold was a gravel yard at the edge of the city. The remaining members were packed inside, armed and shaking, waiting for the Valenti hit squads. They weren't expecting a single, low-slung motorcycle to roar into the yard. Rowan Valenti sat atop a heavy-duty cruiser, her face a mask of porcelain fury. Behind the bike, tied by a thick, industrial-grade steel cable to the rear axle, was the man who had run Storm off the road. He was already a mess of broken bones and terrified screams, his hands bound behind his back. Rowan didn't say a word. She didn't give a speech. She simply looked at the gathered skulls, twisted the throttle until the engine screamed, and kicked the bike into gear. She dragged him. She tore through the gravel, the body behind her bouncing and breaking against the hard earth. She didn't stop at the gates. She rode through the heart of the skull's territory, the sound of the body hitting the pavement a rhythmic, gruesome percussion to the roar of the exhaust. By the time she reached the outskirts, the screaming had stopped. By the time she reached the city limits, what was left behind the bike was barely recognizable as human. She stopped the bike in front of the skull's primary clubhouse, let the engine idle for a moment, and pulled a serrated knife from her boot. With one clean stroke, she cut the cable. The lifeless corpse slumped onto the asphalt, a bloody, shredded warning to anyone who even breathed in Storm Varga's direction. Rowan wiped a stray drop of blood off her cheek, her eyes reflecting the neon open sign of the bar across the street. "Marco," she said into her earpiece. "Burn the rest. I'm going to the hospital." Chapter 13. The Hospital Bed. The antiseptic smell of the ICU was a sharp, sterile contrast to the scent Rowan brought in with her: ozone, burnt rubber, and the metallic tang of a life ended. Storm was awake. Her left arm was a heavy monument of plaster and pins, and a row of dark stitches tracked across her temple like a barbed wire fence. She looked smaller in the hospital bed, stripped of her leather vest and the roar of her engine, but her eyes, those storm cloud eyes, were wide and fixed on the door the moment Rowan stepped through. Rowan didn't look like a CEO. She didn't even look like a queen. She looked like a ghost that had crawled out of a war zone. Her knuckles were split, and a spray of dark, dried crimson flecked the white cuff of her shirt. She stopped at the foot of the bed. For the first time, the steady Rowan Valenti looked like she might shatter if the wind changed direction. "You're alive," Rowan whispered. It wasn't a question, it was an anchor. Storm's gaze dropped to Rowan's hands. She'd heard the whispers from Jax before the nurses cleared the room. She knew about the gravel yard. She knew about the man behind the motorcycle. She knew that while she was fighting for air in an ambulance, Rowan Valenti had been systematically erasing the people who had hurt her, turning the city into a pyre for her sake. The silence stretched, heavy and thick with everything they hadn't said. Any other woman would have been horrified. Any other woman would have called the police or screamed. But Storm just looked at those blood-stained hands and felt a terrifying, deep pull in her chest. It wasn't just loyalty, it was the realization that Rowan was just as clinically insane as she was. "You've got blood on your shirt," Storm said, her voice a dry, pained rasp. It wasn't an accusation. It was an observation of a fact they both now shared. Rowan looked down at herself as if noticing the stains for the first time. She let out a short, jagged breath that was half laugh, half sob. "It's not mine." "I know." Storm shifted, a hiss of pain escaping her teeth as her shattered shoulder protested. She looked toward the plastic guest chair tucked in the corner. "Sit down, Valenti. You look like hell." Rowan hesitated, her usual confidence nowhere to be found. "You told me to leave. You told me you were done." Storm closed her eyes for a second, the image of Rowan pinned against the workbench flashing behind her lids. That felt like a lifetime ago, before the crash, before the blood. "That was before you decided to burn the city down for me," Storm muttered, opening her eyes and fixing Rowan with a look that was weary but, for the first time, lacked the ice. "I'm too tired to fight you tonight. And I'm too broken to throw you out. So just sit. Stay for now." Rowan sat. She didn't try to touch Storm's hand. She didn't try to make a joke or a move. She just sat in the flickering fluorescent light, her blood-stained hands resting on her knees, watching Storm breathe. The beast was quiet, but for the first time in 10 years, Storm Varga didn't feel like she had to be the only predator in the room. Chapter 14. The Recovery. Rowan didn't argue. She didn't offer a witty retort about her presentability or the price of the blood-ruined silk. She simply nodded, her movements stiff, like a machine running low on power. The hospital staff had indeed spent the last hour treating the hallway like a minefield. When Rowan had walked in, the head of nursing had started to open her mouth about visiting hours, but one look into Rowan's hollow, predatory eyes had turned the woman's blood to ice. The nurse had simply handed Rowan a stack of sterile towels and pointed toward the private bathroom in Storm's suite before vanishing. "Fine," Rowan murmured, her voice sounding like crushed glass. "Presentable. I can do that." She retreated into the small, sterile bathroom. Storm watched her go, the heavy click of the lock echoing in the quiet room. A moment later, the sound of water rushing into the sink drifted through the door. Inside the bathroom, Rowan didn't look at herself in the mirror immediately. She couldn't. She stared at the white porcelain sink as the water turned a sickening, diluted pink. She plunged her hands into the heat, scrubbing at her knuckles with a piece of harsh hospital soap. She scrubbed until her skin was raw, until the last traces of the gravel yard were washed down the drain, but the phantom vibration of the motorcycle's throttle still hummed in her marrow. Finally, she looked up. The woman in the mirror was a stranger. Her hair was matted, her eyes were bloodshot, and there was a streak of someone else's life dried across her jawline. The Mafia Queen looked like she had been dragged through the same hell she'd just inflicted on the skulls. A tremor started in her fingers and raced up her arms. She gripped the edges of the sink so hard the porcelain groaned. The adrenaline that had fueled her rampage was gone, replaced by the terrifyingly cold reality of how close she'd come to losing the only thing that made her feel alive. Through the door, Storm heard a soft thud, the sound of a body leaning heavily against a wall, followed by a silence so profound it felt like a scream. "Valenti?" Storm called out, her voice still rough. "Don't die in there. It'll be a bitch to clean up." There was no answer for a long moment. Then, the door opened. Rowan had changed into a simple, dark tracksuit her security team had dropped off at the door. Her hair was damp and pulled back, her face scrubbed pink and raw. She looked stripped down, no silk, no jewelry, no armor. Just a woman who had seen too much and done even more. She walked back to the chair by Storm's bed, but she didn't sit. She stood there, looking down at Storm's pale face, her hands shoved deep into her pockets to hide the shaking. "Better?" Rowan asked, her voice trembling. Storm looked her up and down. The arrogance was gone. The beast was still there, but it was exhausted, curled up in the corner of Rowan's eyes. Marginally, Storm grunted. She reached out her good hand, the one not encased in a cast, and patted the edge of the narrow hospital mattress. It was a small gesture, but in the world of Storm Varga, it was an invitation to a sanctuary. Sit. Real sit. Not the chair. Rowan sank onto the edge of the bed, the weight of the day finally collapsing her spine. She let out a long, shuddering breath and, for the first time, let her forehead rest against the railing of the hospital bed, inches from Storm's hip. "I thought I lost you," Rowan whispered into the sterile sheets. "I've killed men for less than $1, Storm. But when I saw your bike on that newsfeed, I realized I'd burn this entire city to the ground just to keep the smoke from touching you." Storm's fingers hesitated, then slowly settled into Rowan's damp hair. She didn't say "I love you." She didn't say "it's okay." She just let her hand rest there, a heavy, grounding weight. "You're a maniac, Valenti," Storm said softly. "But you're my maniac for the night. Now shut up and try to breathe." Chapter 15. The Quiet Before. The morning light in the ICU was unforgiving, cutting through the blinds in sharp, clinical slats. Rowan had fallen asleep with her head resting on the edge of the mattress, her hand still loosely gripping the fabric of Storm's hospital gown. For the first time since they'd met, the Mafia Queen's face was smooth, the lines of calculation and cruelty washed away by exhaustion. Storm had stayed awake for most of it, watching the steady rise and fall of Rowan's shoulders. She knew the city was likely screaming for its boss, but the boss was currently anchored to a narrow hospital bed in the worst part of town. Taming a beast, Storm thought, her fingers still tangled in Rowan's hair. Who would have thought I'd be the one holding the leash? When Rowan finally stirred, she didn't wake up with a start. She opened her eyes and immediately fixed them on Storm, checking for color in her cheeks, for life in her eyes. The transition back to protector was instantaneous. "You're awake," Rowan murmured, her voice thick with sleep. She sat up, stretching her stiff back. "I'll get the nurse. You need to eat." "I'm fine, Valenti. Go home." "Get some real sleep," Storm grunted, though her stomach betrayed her with a loud, hollow growl. Rowan ignored her. 10 minutes later, she was back with a tray of what the hospital called breakfast, lukewarm oatmeal, and a plastic cup of orange juice. Rowan pulled the rolling table over and picked up the spoon. "I can feed myself," Storm hissed, reaching for the spoon with her good hand. Rowan pulled it back, a flicker of that old arrogance returning to her eyes. "Your good hand is currently hooked to N4, and if you move it too much, the machine beeps. And I find that beep incredibly annoying. Open up, Storm. Don't make this a hostage situation." Storm glared at her, the kind of look that would have made a seasoned biker flee the state. Rowan just blew on a spoonful of oatmeal and waited. Finally, with a grunt of pure indignation, Storm opened her mouth. They went through the meal in a tense, rhythmic silence, a dance of pride and necessity. Rowan was surprisingly gentle, her eyes focused on Storm's lips with a concentration that made Storm's skin itch. "There," Rowan said, setting the empty bowl aside. She wiped a stray drop from the corner of Storm's mouth with her thumb, lingering just a second too long. "Now, for the next order of business. You're covered in road grit and hospital sweat. I've talked to the head nurse. I'm going to help you into the shower." The reaction was instantaneous. If Storm's Harley had slammed on the brakes at 100 miles per hour, it wouldn't have been as violent. "The hell you are." Storm barked, her voice echoing off the tiled walls. She tried to sit up, winced as her shattered shoulder screamed, and slumped back down. I am not, absolutely not, letting you in that bathroom while I'm naked and half dead. Storm, you have one working arm and a dozen stitches, Rowan said, her tone perfectly steady, though a small, wicked smirk played at her lips. You'll slip and break the other shoulder. And frankly, after what I did to the guy who ran you off the road, I think I've earned the right to see the merchandise I'm protecting. It's not merchandise, it's my body. Storm retorted, her face flushing a deep, frustrated red. Send in a nurse. Send in Jax. Send in a stray dog. But you? You're staying on that side of the door. Rowan stood up, stepping into the space between the bed and the bathroom. She didn't look like she was joking anymore. The tension shifted not back to the beast, but to that deep emotional pull. The nurses are terrified of me, Jax is out patrolling the clubhouse, and I don't trust anyone else to touch you, Rowan said softly. She leaned over the bed, her face inches from Storm's. I've seen you at your most dangerous. Let me see you at your most vulnerable. I'm not going to laugh, Storm. And I'm not going to leave. Storm looked into those dark, unwavering eyes. The wall was still there, but the foundation was crumbling. If you make one comment about my scars, Storm warned, her voice dropping to a whisper, I will drown you in that sink. Rowan reached out, her fingers ghosting over the bandages on Storm's shoulder. Your scars are the only honest things in this city, Storm. I wouldn't dream of it. Chapter 16. The Fragile Truth. The bathroom was small, tiled in a sterile, clinical white that felt cold until Rowan turned the handle, letting the room fill with a thick, heavy curtain of steam. The process of getting there had been a battle of wills. Storm had insisted on walking, her jaw set in a grim line of defiance even as she leaned, just a fraction, against Rowan's steady frame. Now, inside the fogged-up room, the banter had finally run out of oxygen. Turn around, Storm muttered, her voice muffled by the humidity. She was struggling with the tie of the hospital gown with her one good hand, her fingers trembling with a mix of frustration and the kind of vulnerability she usually buried under layers of leather and attitude. Rowan didn't move. I'm not looking at you as a conquest, Storm. I'm looking at you as someone who needs to not fall on her face. With a sharp exhale, Storm let the gown slip. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was heavy. Rowan's breath hitched, not out of lust, but out of a sudden, sharp ache in her chest. Storm's body was a map of a life lived on the edge. Beyond the fresh, angry purple of the bruises from the crash, there were old scars, a jagged line from a blade across her ribs, the faded puckers of road rash from years ago. She looked like a warrior who had survived 100 wars, and to Rowan, she had never been more beautiful. The water is warm, Rowan said softly, her voice losing its edge. She helped Storm step over the low lip of the walk-in shower. As the water hit, Storm closed her eyes, a low groan of relief escaping her lips as the heat began to soak into her battered muscles. Rowan stepped in behind her. She didn't take off her own clothes, letting the spray soak through her dark shirt until it clung to her skin. She picked up a sponge, lathered it with gentle soap, and began to work. She started with Storm's good shoulder, her movements slow and reverent. She moved the sponge over the curve of Storm's back, avoiding the bandages, her touch so light it was almost a caress. Storm's head dropped forward, her wet hair clinging to her neck. The Spitfire Angel was gone. In the steam and the heat, she was just a woman allowing herself to be held up by the one person she had sworn to keep out. Why? Storm whispered, the word barely audible over the hiss of the shower. Why all this, Rowan? The city, the bike, the this. Rowan paused, the sponge resting against the small of Storm's back. She leaned forward, pressing her forehead against the space between Storm's shoulder blades. Because everyone else looks at you and sees a leader, or a threat, or a victim, Rowan murmured against her skin. I look at you and I see the only person who ever looked back at me and didn't see a paycheck or a boss. You saw me. And God help me, I think I'd burn the world just to make sure you keep looking. Storm turned slowly, her good arm coming up to rest on Rowan's dripping shoulder. The water ran down their faces, blurring the line between the shower and the tears neither would admit to. Storm looked into Rowan's eyes, the dark, lethal depths of the Mafia Queen, and saw the beast finally at rest. She reached up, her thumb tracing the line of Rowan's wet jaw. "You're a mess, Valenti," Storm whispered, a ghost of a smile finally touching her lips. "I'm your mess," Rowan countered. She leaned in, and this time, there was no workbench, no pride, and no door to open. Rowan's lips met Storm's in a kiss that tasted of salt and steam, a slow, deep pull that felt like the first real breath either of them had taken in years. It wasn't about the fire yet, it was about the anchor. Chapter 17, The Breach. The steamy sanctuary of the bathroom was shattered not by a bullet, but by the frantic, heavy boots of someone who didn't care about privacy. The door flew open, hitting the tile with a crack. "Storm. We've got a." Jax froze, her hand still on the handle, her eyes wide as she took in the scene through the dissipating fog, her formidable leader, dripping and vulnerable, and the Mafia Queen, soaked to the bone and currently holding a sponge like a holy relic. Storm's instinct kicked in. She tried to twist away to cover herself, a hiss of pure, humiliated spunk escaping her. "Jax, get the hell out." But Rowan didn't flinch. She stepped directly into Jax's line of sight, her wet clothes clinging to her like a second skin, her eyes turning into cold, black flint. The transition from tender caregiver to lethal sovereign was so fast it was jarring. "Outside." Now, Rowan commanded. It wasn't a request, it was an execution order in waiting. Jax, who feared nothing on two wheels, took one look at Rowan's expression and backed out, slamming the door. Rowan turned back to Storm. The tenderness was still there, but it was now underlined by a terrifying urgency. She worked fast, wrapping Storm in a thick towel, her movements efficient and protective. She helped her into a clean set of sweats, lifted her back into the bed, and tucked the sheets around her with a finality that brooked no argument. Rowan leaned down, her lips brushing Storm's forehead. "I have a mess to clean up," she whispered, her voice a low, vibrating promise of violence. She walked out into the hospital room, grabbed her encrypted phone, and the beast took the throne. Rowan didn't leave the room. She stood by the window, barking orders that sounded like coordinates for an invasion. "Marco, I don't care about the board's concerns. If a single Skulls member is still standing by dawn, you're all replaced. They hit the warehouse? They touched the angels." Rowan's laugh was a dark, jagged thing. "Level the block. Use the heavy hitters. And Marco, I want the board members who signed off on this brought to the docks. I'll deal with the paperwork personally." She hung up and looked at Jax, who was leaning against the door, still reeling from the shower incident. "Your girls are safe, Jax. My men arrived 2 minutes after the Skulls breached the perimeter. There were no survivors on their side." Jax looked at Storm, then back at Rowan. She gave a slow, begrudging nod. "The Valenti army, they fought like they were protecting their own. I've never seen anything like it." Storm watched Rowan from the bed. The woman was pacing the small room like a caged leopard, her phone lighting up with reports of the carnage she had unleashed. "Rowan," Storm called out. Rowan stopped, the fire in her eyes softening as she looked at the bed. "They almost took everything from me again, Storm. I won't let it happen twice." "Come here," Storm commanded. Rowan walked over, and Storm reached out with her good hand, grabbing Rowan's damp collar and pulling her down. "The war is out there. In here, you're just Rowan. Sit down before you burn a hole in the floor." Chapter 18, The Aftermath of the Storm. The discharge area of the hospital felt like a standoff. The lead doctor, A man who had spent 30 years dealing with trauma, but never a Valenti, stood with his clipboard trembling, trying to explain the protocol for a shattered shoulder and a grade 2 concussion. Rowan didn't even let him finish the sentence. She stepped into his personal space, her height and the sheer, lethal gravity of her presence making the hallway feel 3 feet narrower. She didn't shout. She didn't have to. Her voice was a low, terrifyingly steady vibration. I have a fleet of medical personnel and the best doctors in this goddamn country currently on standby at my home, Rowan said, her eyes locked onto his like a hawk's. She is going with me, where she is safe, where my walls are 10 inches thick, and where I don't have to worry about a protocol failing her. You will sign those papers, or I will buy this hospital just to fire you before the ink dries. Am I clear? The doctor didn't even look at the clipboard. He signed. The Valenti estate wasn't just a house, it was a fortress of limestone and glass tucked away in the hills, guarded by men who looked like they ate thunder for breakfast. When the armored SUV pulled up the winding drive, Storm looked out the window at the manicured lawns and the high iron gates. It was the polar opposite of her grease-stained warehouse. It was quiet, it was opulent, and it felt like a trap. I'm not living in a palace, Valenti, Storm grunted as Rowan helped her out of the car. Her arm was in a fresh sling, and she was pale, but her spunk was returning with a vengeance. I'm a biker. I belong where the air smells like exhaust, not lavender and old money. You belong where people don't try to run you off bridges, Rowan countered, her arm firmly around Storm's waist to steady her. She led Storm inside, past the marble foyer and up a sweeping staircase to a master suite that looked out over the ocean. In the center of the room sat a massive, king-sized bed with silk sheets that looked softer than a cloud. I'm not sleeping in that, Storm said, pointing a finger at the bed. I'll sink and never be found again. You'll sleep there because it's the only place big enough for both of us, Rowan said, finally letting a bit of that playful arrogance slip back into her voice. She walked over to a side table where a bottle of Storm's favorite cheap whiskey, the kind Rowan usually wouldn't use to clean her drains, sat waiting next to 2 crystal glasses. Storm looked at the whiskey, then at the woman who had spent the last 48 hours dismantling a criminal empire. She saw the exhaustion behind Rowan's eyes and the way her hands finally stopped shaking now that they were behind the safety of her own gates. You really did it, didn't you? Storm asked softly. The skulls. The board. You burned it all. Rowan poured 2 fingers of the amber liquid. She handed one to Storm, her fingers lingering against Storm's. I told you. I love a challenge. But I love my property more. Storm took a sip, the burn hitting the back of her throat like a homecoming. I'm not your property, Rowan. Don't get it twisted. No, Rowan whispered, stepping into Storm's space, her gaze dropping to Storm's lips. You're the only person who owns me. And that's much, much worse for my reputation. Chapter 19. The Fire and the Future. The first night at the estate was silent, the kind of silence that usually unnerved Rowan. But with Storm there, the quiet felt full. There was no battle for dominance as Rowan helped Storm settle into those ridiculous silk sheets. The beast hadn't just been tamed, it had been transformed. Rowan moved with a tenderness that would have shocked her associates. Her touch was light, almost reverent, as she propped up Storm's pillows. You're staring, Valenti, Storm murmured, her voice thick with fatigue and the hum of the whiskey. I'm observing my investment, Rowan countered softly, though the bite was gone. She sat on the edge of the mattress and ran her hand over Storm's brow, her thumb tracing the line of the stitches. Go to sleep, Storm. The world isn't allowed to touch you here. For the first time in her life, Storm Varga didn't argue. She let her eyes close, drifting off to the sound of Rowan's steady breathing, realizing that the only thing more dangerous than Rowan Valenti's rage was her devotion. The rusty bolt had never seen a night like this. The gravel lot was a chaotic, beautiful mess of armored Valenti SUVs and chrome-heavy Harley-Davidsons. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of expensive cigars and cheap beer, the smell of a new era. Jax and Marco stood at the bar, an uneasy but functional truce between them as they watched the back booth. "Never thought I'd see it," Jax muttered, nodding toward the door. The room went quiet as the two women walked in. Storm was back on her feet, her arm out of the sling, though a faint, jagged scar on her temple remained as a badge of honor. She looked every bit the leader she was, her gaze scanning the room with that familiar, hurricane gray intensity. But it was Rowan who stole the breath from the room. The Mafia Queen wasn't wearing her usual tailored silk or Italian wool. She walked in wearing dark, form-fitting denim and a heavy, black leather motorcycle jacket. On the back, embroidered in silver thread that caught the dim light, was the Spitfire Angel's crest. She wore it like a coronation robe. "Nice threads, boss," one of the angels hollered, half joking, half odd. Rowan didn't smirk. She reached out and laced her fingers with Storm's, pulling her close as they reached the center of the bar. "The skulls are gone." "The board is quiet," Rowan announced, her voice carrying that effortless, regal authority that now commanded both the boardroom and the street. "From tonight, the docks and the west side belong to the same family. You mess with a Valenti, you answer to the angels. You touch an angel." Storm stepped forward, her hand resting on the hilt of the knife at her belt, her eyes flashing with a dark, satisfied fire. "And the Valenti army will make sure you're never found." The roar that went up from the crowd shook the rafters of the dive bar. It was a merger sealed not in ink, but in blood, fire, and a shared, relentless pride. Rowan leaned into Storm's ear, the scent of leather and Storm's skin intoxicating her more than any vintage wine ever could. "How do I look in my new uniform, Captain?" Storm looked her up and down, a slow, predatory smile spreading across her face as she gripped the lapel of Rowan's jacket, pulling her in for a kiss that tasted like victory. "You look like a disaster, Valenti," Storm whispered against her lips. "My favorite kind." Chapter 20. The Merger. The boardroom at Valenti Enterprises had never looked so unrefined. The air, usually smelling of expensive lilies and filtered oxygen, was currently heavy with the scent of motor oil and burnt tobacco. On one side of the mahogany table sat the survivors of the Valenti board, men in six-figure suits who looked like they were waiting for the guillotine. On the other side sat Jax and two of the Angel's heaviest hitters, their boots resting casually on the polished wood. At the head of the table sat Rowan and Storm. Rowan flicked a gold lighter, the flame illuminating the silver Spitfire Angel crest on her leather lapel. She looked every bit the Mafia Queen, but there was a new, jagged edge to her, one she had caught from the woman sitting beside her. "The proposal is simple," Rowan said, her voice a cool blade cutting through the tension. "The Angels take over all security and logistics for the North Docks. In exchange, Valenti Enterprises provides a front for their legitimate repair shops and ensures the police look the other direction when the bikes need to run fast." One of the board members, a man named Henderson who had survived the recent restructuring by the skin of his teeth, cleared his throat. "Miss Valenti, with all due respect, these women are bikers. We have international interests. Merging our security with a..." He stopped when Storm leaned forward. She didn't say a word. She just reached into her jacket, pulled out a heavy, serrated combat knife, and drove it 2 inches deep into the mahogany table directly in front of Henderson's hands. "The last guy who doubted my girls is currently being scraped off the asphalt of the east side," Storm said, her voice a low, gravelly vibration. "You're not talking about a hobby, Henderson. You're talking about the people who kept your queen alive when your own board was plotting to sell her out." Rowan didn't even blink at the destruction of her $20,000 table. She just reached over and rested her hand over Storm's on the hilt of the knife. "The vote is unanimous," Rowan decided, her eyes sweeping the room with a lethal finality. Meeting adjourned. Jax, take the boys to the garage and show them the new fleet. Henderson, buy a new table. This one is a souvenir. By the time they reached the estate, the sun was dipping below the ocean, painting the cliffs in bruises of purple and gold. The armor was finally shed. The leather jackets were tossed onto the marble floor of the foyer, and the heavy boots were kicked aside. The intimacy between them had shifted. It wasn't just a pull anymore. It was the atmosphere they lived in. In the master suite, the only light came from the moon reflecting off the waves outside. Storm was standing by the window, looking out at the dark water. She felt Rowan step up behind her, the warmth of the other woman's body a constant, grounding heat. Rowan's arms wound around Storm's waist, her chin resting on Storm's shoulder. She could feel the faint ridge of the scars through Storm's thin silk shirt, the history they had survived together. "You're quiet," Rowan whispered, her breath ghosting against Storm's neck. "Just thinking about how much I used to hate you," Storm admitted, leaning her head back against Rowan's shoulder. "The bike, the flowers, you were so damn arrogant." "I was desperate," Rowan corrected, her hands sliding up to cup Storm's face, turning her around so they were chest to chest. The Mafia Queen's eyes were soft, stripped of the ice that had protected her for a decade. "I spent my whole life being the most powerful person in every room, Storm. And then I met a woman who looked at me like I was a flat tire." Storm laughed, a low, genuine sound that vibrated through both of them. She reached up, her fingers tracing the sharp line of Rowan's jaw before tangling in her dark hair. "You were. But you're a hell of a driver once you get going." Rowan pulled her closer, her touch no longer demanding, but deeply, achingly tender. "We're going to burn this city to the ground, aren't we?" "Probably," Storm whispered, her lips hovering an inch from Rowan's. "But at least we'll be the ones holding the matches." The kiss that followed was slow and deep, the kind of kiss that didn't need a warehouse or a war to make it feel vital. It was the sound of two predators finally finding peace in the same cage. Outside, the city roared and bled, but inside the glass walls of the Valenti estate, the Beast and the Angel were exactly where they were meant to be. Epilogue: Joint Empire. The master suite was a cathedral of moonlight and shadows, the only sound the rhythmic crash of the Pacific against the cliffs far below. The air was thick, not with the scent of gunpowder or street grime, but with the heavy, intoxicating warmth of two bodies that had finally stopped fighting the inevitable. In the center of the massive bed, the silk sheets were a tangled mess. Rowan lay on her back, her dark hair fanned out like a halo of ink against the white pillows. Storm was draped over her, her good arm hooked around Rowan's waist, her head resting in the hollow of Rowan's shoulder. The silence wasn't the empty kind Rowan used to fear. It was a sanctuary. "You're thinking again," Rowan whispered, her fingers tracing idle, swirling patterns against the bare skin of Storm's back. She felt the slight hitch in Storm's breath, the way her muscles rippled under the touch. "Thinking about how quiet it is," Storm muttered, her voice muffled against Rowan's skin. "My whole life has been noise. Engines, screaming, sirens. I didn't think I could breathe in a place this still." Rowan shifted, pulling Storm up until they were eye to eye. In the dim light, the Mafia Queen's gaze was stripped of every defense she'd ever built. There was no boss here, no cold calculator. Just a woman who had found her match and intended to keep her. "The noise is still out there," Rowan said, her voice a low, melodic thrum. She reached up, her thumb grazing the scar on Storm's temple with a tenderness that still made Storm's heart skip. "But in here, you don't have to be the captain. You don't have to be the shield." Storm's hand moved, her fingers sliding into the hair at the nape of Rowan's neck, pulling her down until their foreheads touched. The arrogance that had defined their first meeting was long gone, replaced by a raw, visceral need. "And you?" Storm asked, her eyes searching Rowan's. "Who are you when the board isn't watching?" "I'm yours," Rowan promised, the words a sacred oath. She leaned in, her lips meeting Storm's in a kiss that was slow, deep, and tasted of the whiskey they'd shared and the future they'd bought with blood. It wasn't the frantic, adrenaline-fueled heat of the warehouse or the desperation of the hospital. It was the steady, burning glow of a fire that had finally found its hearth. Rowan's hands wandered, memorizing the map of Storm's body, the strength in her shoulders, the dip of her waist, the soft skin that only Rowan was allowed to see. Every touch was an acknowledgement, every sigh a surrender. As the night deepened, the boundaries between them blurred until there was no biker and no mafia, no angel and no beast. There was only the weight of Rowan's body against Storm's, the grounding heat of their intertwined limbs, and the shared pulse that echoed in the quiet room. They fell asleep like that, tangled together so tightly that it was impossible to tell where the fire ended and the storm began. The city below could burn and the empires could crumble, but as long as the air in this room remained theirs, they were untouchable. Thank you so much for listening. Please subscribe and like this video and follow me for more stories. You are always welcome here, and leave me a comment or a thumbs up, just letting me know if you like the story and would like more, or is there perhaps an idea that you would like to share or let me write for you.